January bass fishing can be very difficult because of the cold weather, but it also can be extremely rewarding. There's something about catching bass in cold water that when you do it, it just feels that much more rewarding. And the other thing about fishing cold water, and I've said this a lot on the channel, is you truly have one of the best chances at catching some truly giant bass, some of the biggest bass that swim in your body of water. And in today's video, I want to talk about 5 baits that I simply won't leave home without. Whether I'm pond fishing or fishing from the boat, I'm going to pick up these 5 baits and they're going to be what I use in the month of January. So let's dive right into the baits. Now, the first lure is a lipless crankbait. I don't care where you live in the country, during the month of January, you can more than likely catch them on a lipless crankbait. No matter if your water temperature is like just above freezing, or if you live down south, like in Florida or Texas, usually a lipless crankbait is really good during this time of the year. So I literally always have this bait tied up. Now, one of my absolute favorite lipless crankbaits, it's no secret, it's the Strike King Red Eye Shad. And one of the big things that makes this lipless crankbait a little bit more unique is actually the fall of the bait. And I'm gonna talk about the fall in just a minute and why it's so important during the month of January. But if you watch this bait fall in the water on a slack line, it will actually wiggle back and forth. It's a lot like a fast version of a Senko. If you guys throw a Senko out into the water, you kind of get that back and forth motion of the bait, that little bit of wobble, that little bit of wiggle. And the Strike King Red Eye Shad does kind of that same thing when it falls. It's just a lot faster. Now, in the month of January, or whenever you're fishing cold water, one thing that I like to do with this bait that's a little bit different than other times of the year is I really like to kind of hop that bait and let it fall, kind of like I'm fishing a jig. So whether I'm fishing around grass situations or even in open water, a lot of times I'm just going to simply kill this bait or hop it and let it fall. Some days you go out and that is the only way that they are going to bite a lipless crankbait is on the fall. Now, I'm not saying you have to have the Strike King Red Eye Shad to do this. You can do this with any lipless crankbait. Now, a lot of times when I am fishing this bait, I'm going to be fishing it immediately adjacent to deeper water. And deep water is relative to the body of water you're fishing. If you're fishing some lakes, that may be 20 or 30 foot. In some ponds, this may be 6 or 7 feet. And I'm not necessarily saying you're gonna catch bass in 20 or 30 foot, but as long as you are close to that deeper water, that's typically where you're gonna find bass during the middle of winter and in months like January. Now, if I am fishing a pond, a lot of times I'm actually going to use a 1/4 ounce size lipless crankbait. Growing up, I had a pond in my backyard, and throughout the winter, we would have these random weeks here in Ohio where the weather would be pretty warm. Like we would have 50, 60 degree weather. We're actually having one of those weeks right now. And a lot of times those ponds that were iced over, all of a sudden don't have any ice on them. And the first bait that I would always pick up is a 1/4 ounce lipless crankbait. And I would always get some bites. I would always catch some fish fishing that bait in ponds. Now, when it comes to color selection of a lipless crankbait, just keep this simple. You know, red is something that I pick up a lot during the winter and during spring. And even if there's nothing that looks like this in your body of water, there's just something about red in cold water that bass absolutely love. Now, if I'm fishing in a lake that has a lot of shad, I'm going to go with some sort of shad pattern. Now, in Florida, which I have fished a lot in January, you have a lot of shiners down there. So a lot of times in those situations, I'm gonna have a little bit of gold incorporated somewhere on my lipless crankbait. But the big thing is keep your color selections really, really simple. Now, I primarily fish that lipless crankbait around grass situations and in ponds. I'm not saying that it won't work other than that, but that is really when I pick up the lipless crankbait. Now, if I am fishing more of a rocky bottom or some scattered wood, I'm actually going to pick up a flat-sided crankbait. Now, one of the best cold water flat-sided crankbaits is a Rapala Shad Rap. A lot of guys who have been fishing for a long time know about the Shad Rap and how great it is in cold water. Now, one of the biggest things about a Shad Rap is it is a balsa bait. So it has a very tight wiggle. It doesn't put off a lot of vibration, and a lot of times in cold water, that little bit more subtle or a little bit more tight wiggle really helps you to get a lot more bites. That's why that lipless crankbait can also be so good in cold water. Now, the big thing with a Shad Rap is that they are very light baits. Because these baits are so light and they are very easily caught by the wind, I do fish them on a spinning rod, which is not what I typically do with pretty much any crankbait, but with the Shad Rap, it's almost a must to throw them on a spinning rod. Now, I still like to fish a braid to fluorocarbon leader pretty much anytime I'm fishing with a spinning rod, but in this situation, I think that one, you could get away with straight fluorocarbon and you would have no issues, but I don't necessarily spool up a rod just with fluorocarbon anymore. So what I do is just add a really long fluorocarbon leader. So I'm talking about almost a 20 to 30 foot leader of fluorocarbon attached to my braid. I know that that sounds like a really long leader, and it is, but it's actually not the only technique that I will use a really long leader with. Now, I use the FG knot. That is definitely the best knot when it comes to attaching braid to fluorocarbon. It is a little bit tricky. You could probably get away with it with the Crazy Alberto or even the double uni, but the Crazy Alberto and double uni are definitely a thicker knot, which doesn't always sit best inside of your spinning reel. So I would really suggest learning the FG knot if you want to use a braid to fluorocarbon. But like I said, you could probably just use straight fluorocarbon, 6 or 8 pound test. Now, the big thing with that Shad Rap is you want to fish it as slow as you can while still maintaining bottom contact. So I want to hit the bottom with my bait, but I'm really just reeling that bait pretty much as slow as I can to keep it hitting the bottom from time to time. And usually when a bass bites this, it's not an aggressive bite. It literally feels like all of a sudden you have a bunch of leaves that got caught up on your crankbait. You pull into it and then all of a sudden it starts to pull back and you're like, oh, that is a bass. So a couple of other crankbaits that are really similar to a Shad Rap, but they're actually heavy enough to throw them on a bait casting rod, are the Strike King Lucky Shad and a Bomber Flat A. Again, these are flat-sided crankbaits that I'm going to fish in the exact same way. I get them down and I try to fish them as slow as I can while maintaining bottom contact. Before we get into lure number 3, I want to thank today's sponsor, which is sportsmansoutfitters.com. Not only can you pick up all these lures that we're talking about at Sportsman's Outfitters, but you can typically save a lot of money by shopping there. And right now, until January 10th, they still have some sales going on where you can save even more money. If you guys want to help support the Bass Fishing HQ channel, click those links down below in the description and shop at Sportsman's Outfitters today. Lure number 3 is one that pretty much every bass fisherman probably owns. Even if you are just getting into bass fishing, you probably already own this lure, and it is a great cold water lure, and that is the good old-fashioned shaky head straight-tailed worm. If I'm being 100% honest with you guys, I really don't even like throwing I'm still not sure about that. Siri, be quiet. I do not love throwing a shaky head worm. There are a lot of other techniques that I would rather choose. But with that being said, I know how good a shaky head works in cold water. And so I always have one tied up, especially if it is just really difficult for me to get bit. A lot of times I'm just gonna pick up that shaky head and soak that bait. Now that's probably the biggest thing that I do with the shaky head during the month of January in cold water is really fish that thing as slow as I can. If you guys are noticing, there's a pattern with a lot of these lures that I'm talking about, and it's about fishing them slow. And it's something that is so hard to do, especially when it is cold out, but it will greatly help you to catch a lot more bass. Now, you could probably substitute a Ned rig for a shaky head, but something that I like to do a lot in the winter is fish brush piles in clear water that are really close to some sort of drop. Maybe it's on the end of a point that drops down into the main lake basin, or maybe on a creek channel swing of some sort. And typically a shaky head is going to come through that wood brush pile cover a little bit better than a Ned rig. So a lot of times I am going to pick up a shaky head this time of the year. I typically like to use the lightest weight that I can get away with. A lot of times this is an 1/8 ounce weight with some sort of straight tail worm. I like a robo worm a lot of times on my shaky head, or just a good old Zoom trick worm that I'll bite down. Usually somewhere between 4.5 inches and 6 inches is the size of the straight tail worm that I will put on that bait. And again, work it so slow. This is a great pond bait. This is a great lake bait. You can catch fish anywhere on a shaky head pretty much any time of the year, not just in January. Now, moving on to lure number 4. This is one that is a little bit controversial, but I'm telling you, it just catches bass so well in cold water, and that is an Alabama rig. Now, some states, you actually can't even fish an Alabama rig. Some states you can only have 3 hooks. Some states allow you to have 5 hooks or more. In Ohio, where I live, you can fish an Alabama rig if it has 3 hooks on it. And this is just a bait that if they are biting the A rig, the Alabama rig, there are days where they're biting it and they will not bite anything else, literally anything else. You can fish everything you want to at these fish and they will not bite until you pick up an Alabama rig. There's just something about an Alabama rig and the way that it looks like a school of fish that just entices bass that are lockjaw to all of a sudden start committing to a bait. Now, if you have some sort of forward-facing sonar like the Mega Live that I have, this is a super fun way to go out there and catch bass by actually seeing fish, casting to them just above them, and watching them come up to eat your bait. It's a great way to also catch an absolute giant. You guys know one of my buddies, Tyler Anderson from Tyler's Real Fishing, guy caught a 14-pounder on an A-rig in Texas last year. Now, I'm not saying you're gonna catch a 14-pounder. I know in Ohio, we don't even have 14-pounders, but an A-rig truly is one of the best ways to catch them in cold water. Now, I like a little bit more of a finessey A-rig. This is a Flash Mob Junior. I actually have 3.3-inch Kitex on this, and on the very top, my 2 dummy baits, I actually have 2.8-inch Kitex. So it's very finessey. I use straight 20-pound fluorocarbon, a 7-foot 6-inch rod, and a 7.1-to-1 gear ratio reel. Here's the thing. I know that some of you guys may not love the A-rig, but I challenge you to just try it, because when you start catching fish on it, or multiple fish on it, it's just so much fun. It's a great way to go out there and catch bass. Now, speaking of catching big fish, the 5th and final January lure is a football jig. A football jig is one of the best ways to catch some really big bass in the middle of January. Now, with a football jig, I typically like about a 1/2 ounce football jig most of the places that I fish, but I like to have one that is pretty compact. I really like to trim down that skirt, put a smaller chunk trailer on the back of it, and I am going to, most of the time, drag this bait really slow. There are days where you can fish this instead of a shaky head. The only thing is, a shaky head is gonna get you a lot more bites, but that football jig fished really slow is going to catch some meat. It's going to catch some really big fish. Now, you may fish it all day and not get 5 bites. So if you're a tournament guy like myself, that is the one thing that you kind of have to weigh in your game plan is, hey, do I fish it all day long and get those 5 bites? Or do I kind of mix in some other baits? But it is a great way, like the A-rig, to catch some mondos, to catch some really big bass. And in this video right here, I talk all about fishing a football jig. So if you want to learn more about a football jig, click that link right there. Also, if you want to help support the Bass Fishing HQ channel further, you can buy some fin fishing apparel right here. Thanks for watching, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys in the next video.